The edge of Miller's Hill dropped away into a sheer, unforgiving slope. Jacob stood at the very brink, his boots digging into the loose earth. He ignored the biting morning air that stung his skin, focusing entirely on the frame of the sky sailor. His fingers traced the tension of the wires, feeling the slight vibration of the wind against the stretched silk. It was a fragile thing, a collection of salvaged parts held together by nothing more than grit and wire. Behind him, the town of Oakhaven lay in absolute silence. He could feel their gaze, a heavy, expectant weight pressing against his back. They were waiting for the inevitable failure, the moment the wood would snap. Jacob did not look back. He reached out to check the rudder, his hands moving with practiced, rhythmic precision. The fishing line was taut. He adjusted the tension one final time, locking the mechanism into place. The machine groaned, a low sound of wood shifting against metal. He took a long, sharp breath, filling his lungs with the cold, thin air. He gripped the wooden frame until his knuckles turned white. The sky ahead was vast. Jacob lunged forward. His first step was heavy. His second was faster. He drove his legs into the dew-slicked grass, forcing the machine to follow his momentum. The frame rattled violently, a chaotic clatter of aluminum and wood that threatened to shake itself apart. He kept his eyes locked on the horizon, ignoring the uneven ground that pulled at his heels. Halfway down the slope, his left foot slipped on a patch of wet clover. He stumbled, his shoulder slamming into the wooden frame. He corrected his balance with a desperate, lunging stride, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. He pushed harder, legs burning, until the ground simply stopped. The sudden absence of resistance hit him like a physical blow. His stomach lurched as the world beneath his feet vanished. The frame groaned, the silk wings snapped taut, and the violent shaking smoothed into a steady, terrifying lift. The town of Oakhaven shrank rapidly, its rooftops turning into miniature, colourful blocks scattered across the valley floor. Jacob felt the initial jolt of the updraft subside, replaced by a steady, soaring pressure against the wings. He reached for the fishing line rudder, his fingers finding the familiar tension he had calibrated in the garage. He pulled gently to the left. The machine responded with a slow, deliberate bank, tilting the horizon. Below him, the pine trees now appeared as nothing more than a dark, textured carpet. A sudden gust of wind caught the right wing, causing the frame to shudder and dip sharply. His heart hammered against his ribs, but he did not panic. He braced his weight, leaning into the resistance, and tightened the line. The glider leveled out, the silk wings snapping back into a perfect taut arc. The violent roar of the wind smoothed into a rhythmic, steady hum. Every adjustment of the rudder felt like an extension of his own body. The terror of the launch had evaporated, replaced by the sharp, clear focus of a pilot in command. He looked down at the shrinking world. Jacob pulled the control bar back, urging the machine to climb. The air grew thin, biting at his skin, and the world below dissolved into a hazy tapestry of muted greens and browns. As the altitude increased, the rhythmic hum of the wings began to fade, replaced by a haunting, familiar silence. It was the same silence that had followed his first attempt at flight. He saw the image clearly, the cardboard frame collapsing, the sickening thud of the machine hitting the bushes, and the sharp, jagged sound of his classmates' laughter echoing across the field. That memory felt heavier than the machine itself. He gripped the wooden frame until his knuckles turned white, the ghost of that failure clawing at his focus. Back then, the sting of their words had been more painful than the impact with the ground. He had stood in the dirt, surrounded by the wreckage of his ambition, while the entire town watched his defeat. Now he was thousands of feet above those same people, yet the phantom sensation of that laughter still vibrated in his ears. He pushed the machine higher, forcing himself to look away from the horizon and into the vast empty blue. He had to prove that the boy who sat in the dirt was gone. The memory of the garage hit him with the force of a gale. He saw the dim light of a single bulb flickering over his workbench. His fingers were raw, the skin cracked from the biting cold as he twisted thin copper wire around the willow frame. Every knot was a battle against his own exhaustion. He recalled the second failure, the sickening splintering of wood as the machine slammed into the garden fence. The neighbors had stood on their porches, their whispers cutting through the night. He had sat in the dirt for hours, his hands stained with grease and glue, methodically retying every snapped line while the frost settled on his shoulders. That was the price of this moment. He had spent those nights alone, ignored and ridiculed, building the very wings that now held him aloft. The memory of that humiliation was not a burden. It was fuel. He tightened his grip on the control bar, feeling the wire-reinforced frame vibrate against his palms. He didn't just remember the failure, he felt the stubborn, burning resolve. He leaned forward, forcing the machine to bite into the wind. The sky was no longer a dream he had chased in the dark. It was a territory he had earned. He was the pilot of his own defiance. And he refused to let the ghost of the fence pull him down. Jacob reached for the locking lever mounted on the central spar. His fingers, still marked by the grime of his workshop, gripped the cold metal. With a sharp, decisive pull, he engaged the mechanism. The wing pitch locked into place, and the machine stopped its erratic shuddering, settling into a smooth, unwavering glide. The tension in his shoulders evaporated. He was no longer fighting the air, he was moving with it. Below him, the town of Oakhaven had vanished, replaced by a sprawling quilt of deep forest greens and earthen browns. The scale of the world had shifted. Everything that once seemed monumental, the hill, the fence, the neighbors' houses, was now just a tiny, insignificant speck in the vast expanse. He banked the machine, feeling the air pressure shift against the silk wings. The sky sailor responded with fluid precision, carving a wide, gentle arc through the atmosphere. He was dancing with the currents, a pilot suspended in the deep, silent blue. The wind no longer roared. It sang a steady, rhythmic note against the frame. He was the master of his own altitude, drifting through the clouds in a moment of pure, transcendent stillness. The world below was a distant tapestry. The steady hum of the wind began to falter. The air beneath the wings thinned, and the sky sailor dipped, losing the invisible support that had kept it aloft. Jacob felt the sudden drop in his stomach, a sharp reminder of gravity's claim. He did not panic. He shifted his weight, leaning hard into the left turn to catch a trailing thermal, but the air was spent. The descent had begun. He steered the nose toward the wide open meadow at the base of the valley, his eyes locked on the patch of green clover. The machine picked up speed, the frame whistling as it sliced through the cooling air. He pulled back on the rudder lines, fighting the drag, forcing the wings to flare. The ground rushed up, a blur of textures and colours. He held his breath, his knuckles white against the wooden frame. The wheels made contact with the earth, biting into the soft soil with a sharp, rhythmic crunch. The machine skidded, the willow branches groaning under the sudden friction before coming to a complete, shuddering halt. The silence that followed was absolute. Jacob sat motionless for a heartbeat, his chest heaving. The silence of the meadow lasted only a second. Then it broke. A wave of sound rolled down from Miller's Hill, a collective roar that defied the distance. Jacob blinked, his ears ringing as the cheers reached him, sharp and unmistakable. He looked up toward the crest. The townspeople were no longer standing in cold, judgmental clusters. They were moving, spilling down the slope toward the meadow. Jacob reached for the latch on the side of the frame, but his fingers refused to cooperate. His hands were shaking, a violent tremor born of adrenaline. He took a deep, jagged breath, forced his grip to steady, and unhooked the brace. He pushed himself up, his legs buckling momentarily. He stumbled out of the sky sailor, his boots sinking into the clover. He looked back at the hill, then at the faces rushing toward him, the whispers that had followed him through the winter, the quiet mockery in the garage. It was all gone. In its place was a stunned, collective silence. He stood tall, his knees still vibrating, watching the neighbors close the distance. They were looking at a pilot who had returned from the clouds. The roar of the crowd became a distant hum, a background static that no longer dictated his pulse. Jacob stood still, his boots anchored in the clover, and lifted his hands before his eyes. They were mapped with the evidence of his labor: dark smears of grease, thin lines of dried glue, and small jagged nicks from wire and wood. He did not wipe them clean. He traced the rough skin of his palms, feeling the texture of the work that had made the impossible real. The sky, once a vast and unreachable ceiling, now felt like a familiar territory. He turned his head slowly, ignoring the reaching hands and the shouting voices of the neighbors, and fixed his gaze on the horizon. The weight of the past winter, the nights in the cold garage, the splintering wood, the stinging laughter dissolved into the wind. He had built a vessel from the discarded remnants of the town, and in doing so, he had dismantled the boundaries they had placed around him. He took a long, steady breath, the air filling his lungs with the clarity of altitude. The horizon was no longer a limit. It was a destination. He was not just a boy standing in a meadow anymore. He was a pilot. He had claimed his place among them, and he would never look at the ground the same way again.